It all begins with a hobbit, a small creature with hairy feet, who loved his routine more than any treasure in the world. For him, an adventure was something bothersome, uncomfortable, and something that would surely delay dinner. But fate sometimes doesn't knock on the door. It arrives for dinner uninvited, in the company of 13 noisy dwarves and a pointy-headed wizard. It's a journey about how the greatest of adventures can be born from the greatest of comforts, and how a hero can be found where you least expect one. So find your warm spot, leave the world outside, and step into this hobbit hole in the heart of the Shire. The adventure is about to begin. Sweet dreams. Bag End and the Hobbit, who didn't want adventures in the heart of the Shire. On a green, grassy hill, there was a hole in the ground. It was not a nasty, dirty hole, but the residence of a hobbit. And that meant comfort. Its perfectly round door, painted a cheerful green, had a polished brass knob right in the center. When it opened, it revealed a tunnel-like hallway lined with wood and a tiled floor covered with carpets. A cozy and smoke-free place. The best rooms, with their round, deep-set windows, looked out onto the garden and the fields that stretched all the way to the river. Here lived a very well-to-do hobbit whose name was Bilbo Baggins. The Bagginses were a respected family, known for their wealth, but especially for their predictability. They never got involved in adventures or did anything unexpected. Bilbo, in particular, treasured routine, the comfort of his well-stocked pantry, and the peace of smoking his pipe on the porch. He was a hobbit content with his simple and organized life. Everything began to change one quiet morning while Bilbo enjoyed his pipe after breakfast. A tall, imposing figure approached. It was an old man with a pointed blue hat, a gray cloak, and a long white beard that fell over a silvery scarf. It was Gandalf the Wizard, a name associated with remarkable tales and unexpected events. Exactly the kind of thing a Baggins avoided. After a brief and enigmatic exchange of words about the meaning of good morning, Gandalf revealed the purpose of his visit. He was looking for someone to share an adventure. Bilbo's reaction was immediate and predictable. Adventures to him were unpleasant and bothersome things that would certainly delay dinner. Firmly, he dismissed the wizard and retreated into his hobbit hole, closing the round door behind him. But before leaving, Gandalf scratched a subtle sign on the green door, a symbol that would seal the hobbit's fate. The next day, shortly before tea time, Bilbo's tranquility was broken by a loud knock on the door. It wasn't Gandalf, but a dwarf with a blue beard and a dark green hood. It was Dwalin, and he entered as if expected. Soon after, the doorbell rang again and again and again. One after another, 12 more dwarves arrived, filling Bilbo's hobbit hole with their colorful beards, hoods, and heavy boots. Bowin, Fili, Kili, Dori, Nori, Ori, Yin, Glowing, Biffer, Boffer, and Bombur. Finally, with an authoritative knock, their leader arrived. The proud Thorin Oakenshield, followed by Gandalf himself. The hobbit hole, once a sanctuary of peace, turned into a chaotic banquet hall. The dwarves ate, drank, and emptied Bilbo's larder with an impressive appetite. The poor hobbit ran back and forth, trying to serve everyone, completely overwhelmed by the invasion. But then the atmosphere changed. The dwarves took out harps, fiddles, and flutes, and in the silence that followed, their deep voices echoed in an old and melancholic song. They sang of distant mountains, of deep burrows, and of a lost treasure guarded by a terrible dragon. The melody awakened something inside Bilbo, an old spark of curiosity and a yearning for places he only knew in stories. The Tookish side of his family, famous for its adventurous nature, stirred. When the music ended, Thorin spread an ancient map on the table. It showed the lonely mountain, with the menacing figure of a dragon drawn upon it. Gandalf pointed to a secret room, visible only under the light of the moon, that revealed the location of a secret entrance. The mission was clear. Travel to the mountain, confront the dragon Smaug, and reclaim the ancestral treasure of the dwarves of Erebor. They needed a burglar, an expert in stealth, and the mark Gandalf had left on Bilbo's door indicated him as the ideal candidate. The Hobbit, caught between panic and a sudden, inexplicable urge of courage, found himself agreeing to the plan. To his own surprise, the Tookish blood had spoken loudest. But the reality of the situation hit him hard, and with a squeak, he fainted on the hearthrug. The adventure had begun, and Bilbo Baggins' comfortable world would never be the same. The journey begins when Bilbo woke up the next morning. The hobbit hole was surprisingly quiet and tidy. For a moment, he thought the chaotic night with the dwarves was nothing more than a strange dream. But the clean hearth and the pile of washed dishes left by the visitors were proof that it had all been real. He felt a mix of relief and a subtle pang of disappointment. The adventure seemed to have left without him, and life would return to its comfortable, predictable rhythm. While he ate his breakfast, he found a note left by Thorin, stuck to a clock on the mantelpiece. The message was formal and direct. They thanked him for his hospitality and were waiting for him at the Green Dragon Inn in Bywater at 11 o'clock sharp. The note mentioned the terms of his contract as a burglar: 1/14 of the treasure, plus all travel expenses paid. Suddenly, the adventure became terrifyingly real. Bilbo's heart pounded, torn between the fear of the unknown and the curiosity that the dwarves' song had awakened. Time passed quickly. The safety of his hobbit hole, the familiar sound of the clock, the smell of toasted bread, everything conspired to keep him there. But the words of the note and the image of the map would not leave his mind. With an impulse that surprised himself, Bilbo ran out the door, forgetting his hat, his walking stick, and most importantly, his handkerchief. He ran through the lanes of the Shire, passing other hobbits who looked at him in astonishment, until he reached the inn exactly 1 minute before the deadline. There they were, the 13 dwarves and Gandalf, ready to depart. Mounted on a small pony, Bilbo felt completely out of place. The journey began under a gray and rainy sky. The familiar landscapes of the Shire soon gave way to strange and desolate lands. The nights were cold and uncomfortable, and the hobbit, accustomed to his warm bed, missed his hobbit hole with every step. He was a terrible adventurer, and knew it. The first real test came a few nights later, when the rain forced them to seek shelter. 3 mountain trolls, named Bert, Tom, and William, had set up camp and were roasting a mutton over a bonfire. The hungry dwarves decided that the company's burglar should prove his worth. Bilbo's mission was to investigate and, if possible, steal something to eat without being noticed. Trembling with fear, Bilbo crept up to the camp. He tried to steal a purse from one of the trolls' pockets, but the enchanted purse shrieked and gave him away. The trolls captured him easily, and soon after, the dwarves who came to his rescue were caught one by one and tied up in sacks, ready to be roasted and eaten. The situation seemed desperate, but in the darkness, Gandalf intervened. Hidden among the trees, the wizard began to mimic the trolls' voices, making them argue and bicker among themselves about how to cook the prisoners. The discussion dragged on, and the trolls, night creatures of little intelligence, did not notice that time was passing. With the first ray of sun, they turned to stone, petrified forever by the light of day. Freed, the dwarves and Bilbo explored the trolls' cave. They found gold, food, and most importantly, weapons. 2 elvish swords from the ancient city of Gondolin were found. Glamdring, the foe hammer, which Gandalf took for himself, and Orcrist, the goblin cleaver, which Thorin claimed. Bilbo, in turn, found a small dagger, the perfect size for a hobbit to use as a sword. He kept it, still unaware of how crucial it would become. The experience with the trolls taught Bilbo a harsh lesson. The world outside the Shire was dangerous, full of creatures who would not hesitate to devour him. But it also showed that intelligence and cunning, like Gandalf's, could be more powerful than brute force. The adventure, though terrifying, was beginning to reveal its complexities. He still missed home, but a small spark of courage, until then unknown, was starting to burn in his heart. The journey had only just begun, and the dangers that awaited them were much greater than 3 stupid trolls in a dark forest. Rivendell and the secrets of the map. After the frightening encounter with the trolls, Thorin's company continued their journey, feeling the weight of the adventure more and more present. The path led them through progressively wilder and more imposing landscapes, very different from the gentle hills of the Shire. The world seemed older, laden with a history that Bilbo could barely begin to comprehend. Finally, after weeks of travel, they arrived at a hidden valley, a place of serene and ethereal beauty, protected by steep slopes and the murmur of a river. It was Rivendell, or Imladris, the last homely house east of the sea, founded by Elrond the half-elven. It was a refuge of peace, wisdom, and elvish culture, a sanctuary against the shadows spreading across Middle-earth. Dwarves by nature were distrustful of elves. There were ancient grudges and resentments between the 2 races, mainly related to treasures and wounded pride. Thorin, in particular, carried a deep bitterness. Even so, the need for rest, food, and counsel overcame his reluctance. Gandalf led them across a narrow bridge that spanned the river, toward a great hall lit by elvish lanterns that glowed among the trees. Bilbo was enchanted. Rivendell's architecture seemed to blend with nature, with halls open to the starry sky and gardens that descended in terraces to the riverbanks. The air was filled with the sound of music and elvish songs, melodies that seemed both joyful and melancholic. It was a place where time seemed to pass differently, an echo of an older and nobler age. They were received by Elrond, the Lord of Rivendell. His appearance was timeless. He seemed neither young nor old, and in his eyes was the wisdom of millennia. As a half-elven, he had chosen the immortality of his elvish lineage. He was noble, gentle, and possessed a deep knowledge of the history of Middle-earth. Elrond examined the swords that Gandalf and Thorin had found in the Troll's Cave. With his vast knowledge, he identified them as famous blades, forged in the ancient city of Gondolin, which had been destroyed in ages past during the wars against the first Dark Lord, Glamdring. Gandalf's sword had belonged to the king of Gondolin. Orcrist, Thorin's sword, was an equally famous blade. Knowing they carried weapons of such lineage gave the dwarves a new sense of purpose and pride. But the most important revelation came when Elrond examined Thorin's map. Under the light of the crescent moon, on the very night it was written, Elrond was able to read secret runes that neither Gandalf nor the dwarves had noticed. They were moon letters, a type of rune invented by the dwarves that could only be seen when the moon shone behind them. The runes revealed a crucial message. Stand by the gray stone when the thrush knocks. The hidden text said, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole. Durin's day, Elrond explained, was the first day of the dwarves' new year, when the last moon of autumn and the sun were in the sky at the same time. The prophecy indicated that on that specific day, the last light of the sun would reveal the secret entrance to the Lonely Mountain. The discovery renewed the company's hope, but also added an urgency to their mission. They would need to reach the mountain before the end of autumn. During their stay in Rivendell, Bilbo felt more at home than at any other time since he had left the Shire. He listened to the stories of the elves, ate well, and rested in a comfortable bed. He could have stayed there forever, but the journey called them. With renewed strength and a new understanding of their mission, the company said goodbye to Elrond and Rivendell. They were about to enter the most dangerous lands of their journey, the Misty Mountains. The refuge of peace was left behind. Ahead awaited them frozen peaks, thunderstorms, and creatures much older and more malevolent than the trolls they had faced. The path to the Lonely Mountain would be fraught with danger at every turn. Mountains, goblins, and the escape from Gollum, the tranquility of Rivendell was left behind like a distant dream. The company now faced the formidable barrier of the Misty Mountains, a chain of imposing and treacherous peaks that cut across Middle-earth. The path was steep and dangerous, and the weather became their enemy. A violent lightning storm caught them in a narrow pass, with stone giants hurling rocks at each other from the heights, a terrifying spectacle that forced them to seek refuge in a small cave. The cave seemed safe and dry, a welcome relief after the storm. Exhausted, they fell asleep. But in the middle of the night, Bilbo was awakened by a sense of dread. A fissure opened at the back of the cave, and dozens of goblins, deformed and cruel creatures that inhabited the depths of the mountains, emerged and captured them. They were dragged into the bowels of the earth, through dark and foul-smelling tunnels, to the great goblin's chamber. The great goblin, an immense and grotesque creature, interrogated Thorin, immediately recognizing the sword Orcrist, the goblin cleaver, a blade that had killed countless of his kind in ancient wars. Enraged, he ordered their execution. Just as the goblins advanced, the lights in the cave went out, and a powerful voice echoed in the darkness. Gandalf, who had escaped capture, appeared with his sword Glamdring, glowing with a cold blue light. The wizard killed the great goblin and led the dwarves' desperate escape through the labyrinthine tunnels. In the confusion, while being carried by one of the dwarves, Bilbo fell and hit his head, being left behind. When he woke up, he was alone in complete darkness, disoriented and terrified. He began to crawl, trying to find a way out. His hand touched something cold and metallic on the tunnel floor. It was a ring. Without thinking, he put it in his pocket, continuing his blind journey. Bilbo reached the banks of a cold and dark underground lake. There, on a small rocky island in the middle of the lake, lived an ancient and lonely creature named Gollum. Gollum was a small and skinny being with large pale eyes that shone in the darkness. He moved in a small boat, propelling himself with his wide, flat feet, and fed on fish and occasionally unwary goblins. Gollum spotted Bilbo and, curious, paddled toward him. He possessed a treasure, a golden ring that made him invisible, and which he called My Precious. It was the same ring that Bilbo had found, but Gollum did not yet know he had lost it. Seeing Bilbo as a potential meal, but also intrigued, Gollum proposed a game, a riddle game. If Bilbo won, Gollum would show him the way out. If Gollum won, he would eat Bilbo. The game began. The riddles were about things they both knew: the wind, the sun, time, teeth. One after another, they exchanged riddles, tension growing in the darkness. Bilbo, feeling cornered, could not think of a last riddle. Desperate, with his hand in his pocket, he felt the ring and asked aloud to himself, "What have I got in my pocket?" Gollum, thinking it was a riddle, became furious. He protested, saying it wasn't a fair question. Bilbo insisted, and Gollum, unable to guess, lost the game. But instead of showing the way out, he returned to his island to get his ring and use it to kill Bilbo. It was then that he discovered the ring was gone. Gollum's despair and rage were terrifying. He realized that Bilbo had his precious, and with a shriek of fury, he set out to attack him. In a panic, Bilbo stumbled, and the ring slipped onto his finger. Immediately, he became invisible. Gollum ran right past him without seeing him, and went toward the passage that led out, thinking Bilbo had escaped that way. Invisible, Bilbo followed the creature. He reached an exit blocked by goblins. He had the chance to kill Gollum, who was lamenting the loss of his ring, but he felt pity for the miserable and lonely creature. In an act of compassion, he jumped over Gollum and ran for freedom, narrowly escaping the goblin guards. Finally, Bilbo emerged from the mountains, back into the open air. He had escaped alone and unarmed, but with a new and mysterious power in his pocket. He had faced darkness and death, and survived, not by strength, but by luck and a flash of pity. He did not yet know it, but the ring he carried would change not only his journey, but the fate of all Middle-earth. Out of the woods, into the house of Beorn, emerging from the dark depths of the Misty Mountains, Bilbo found himself alone on a rocky hillside, with the setting sun casting long shadows. The joy of having escaped soon gave way to worry. He didn't know where Gandalf and the dwarves were, or even if they had survived. Using the ring to become invisible, he crept through the forest, hearing voices in the distance. They were his companions, discussing his fate, believing that the Hobbit had been captured or killed by the goblins. With a newfound sense of drama, Bilbo decided to surprise them. He suddenly appeared in the middle of the group, to the astonishment and relief of everyone. His reputation as a burglar grew immensely. He wisely did not mention the ring, attributing his escape to his own cunning and luck. The company was reunited, but their problems were far from over. Soon after the reunion, the sound of howling echoed through the forest. A pack of wargs, huge and evil wolves, allies of the goblins, had picked up their scent. The company ran, seeking refuge at the top of a clump of trees. The wargs surrounded them, growling and scratching at the trunks, blocking any escape. The situation worsened when the goblins, who were also pursuing them, arrived and began to set fire to the trees. Trapped, with the flames rising, hope seemed lost. It was then that from the sky came the great eagles of the Misty Mountains, led by Gwaihir, the Lord of the Winds. The eagles were noble and ancient creatures who did not get involved in the affairs of men or dwarves, but who owed Gandalf a favor. They descended from the heavens, grabbing the dwarves, Bilbo, and the wizard with their powerful talons, and carried them away from danger. Flying high above the mountains, the view from above was breathtaking, but also terrifying. They were left in safety on an isolated crag, the Carrick, from which they could see the vast expanse of Mirkwood before them, their next and dreaded destination. Before facing the forest, Gandalf took them to a place of refuge. He guided them to the house of Beorn, a mysterious and powerful man who lived alone between the mountains and the forest. Beorn was a skin changer, a man who could take the form of a gigantic black bear. He was reclusive, disliked strangers, and had a particular hatred for orcs and goblins. Gandalf, knowing Beorn's distrustful nature, used his cunning to introduce the company. He arrived first with Bilbo, telling the story of their journey. Gradually, in intervals, the dwarves arrived in pairs, interrupting the narrative and arousing Beorn's curiosity instead of his anger. The tactic worked. Beorn, though rude and imposing, was intrigued by the story and offered them hospitality. Beorn's house was a long wooden building surrounded by gardens of flowers and giant bees. Inside, intelligent animals served at the table, and the food was plentiful and delicious, especially honey and cream. The company spent a few days there, resting and recuperating. At night, they would hear the sound of a great bear scratching at the door and knew that their host was roaming his lands in his other form. Beorn, after verifying their story by capturing and interrogating a warg and a goblin, was convinced of the truth of their mission. He helped them, providing them with food for the journey, ponies, and vital advice on how to cross Mirkwood. His most important warning was that under no circumstances should they leave the path. The forest was ancient, full of dark enchantments, and to stray from the path would mean being lost forever. With Beorn's warning echoing in their minds, the company said goodbye. They arrived at the entrance to Mirkwood, a mass of dark and tangled trees that seemed to swallow the sunlight. There, Gandalf left them. He had other urgent matters to attend to in the south, related to a growing shadow that he and other wizards were investigating. He promised to meet them again before the end of the journey, but for now, they would be on their own. Without Gandalf's leadership and protection, the company felt a deep fear. The path ahead was narrow and dark. The journey through Mirkwood would be the hardest test they had ever faced, a challenge not just of strength, but of will and sanity. Mirkwood, the forest of shadows. The entrance to Mirkwood was like the mouth of a cave, dark and silent. As soon as the company entered, the air became heavy and still, and the sunlight disappeared, blocked by a dense canopy of ancient and tangled trees. The only sound was the rustle of leaves under their feet, and occasionally the noise of something moving in the shadows, out of sight. Beorn's warning about not leaving the path echoed in their minds, and they stayed together, overcome by a feeling of claustrophobia and dread. The days turned into a somber monotony. There was no distinction between day and night under the trees, only a constant twilight. Time seemed to drag, and the food and water that Beorn had given them began to run low. The forest seemed to test their sanity. They saw strange eyes glowing in the darkness, and the path became increasingly difficult to follow. One day, they came to an enchanted river that crossed the path. The water was black and seemed sleepy. Beorn had warned them not to touch the water, as it caused a deep sleep and forgetfulness. They found a boat on the other side, and with the help of a hook and a rope, they managed to pull it across. While crossing, Bombur, the fattest dwarf, fell into the water. They rescued him, but he immediately fell into a deep sleep, and the others had to carry him, a heavy burden that made the journey even more difficult. Hungry and disheartened, they began to see flickering lights and hear songs in the distance, off the path. They were the wood elves, celebrating in hidden clearings. Desperate for food and help, they forgot Beorn's warning and tried to approach. But each time, as soon as they stepped off the path, the lights went out and the elves disappeared, leaving them lost in the darkness. In the confusion, Bilbo got separated from the dwarves. Alone and terrified, he fell asleep, exhausted. When he woke up, he felt something sticky wrapping around him. A giant spider had captured him and was about to wrap him in its web. With a desperate effort, Bilbo managed to grab his small sword. Fighting in the darkness, he killed the spider. This act of courage, performed alone and without help, was a turning point for the hobbit. He felt different, stronger. He named his blade Sting. Using his ring to become invisible, Bilbo went in search of the dwarves. He found them not far away, all hanging in giant spider webs, like flies in a macabre pantry, while the spiders discussed how to devour them. Bilbo devised a plan. He threw rocks in different directions, provoking and confusing the spiders, luring them away from the dwarves. While the creatures were distracted, he ran and cut the webs, freeing his friends. A fierce battle followed. The dwarves, though weak and poisoned, fought bravely. Bilbo, using the ring's invisibility, would appear and disappear, stabbing the spiders with his sting and diverting their attention. They managed to fight and escape, but in the confusion, they discovered that Thorin was not with them. He had been captured by the wood elves. Exhausted and without their leader, the other dwarves continued, but did not get far. Soon they, too, were surrounded and captured by the wood elves, led by their king Thranduil. The elves were cautious and distrustful of strangers, especially of dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure in ages past. They were taken to the king's underground palace, a vast complex of caves and halls carved into the side of a mountain. Bilbo again escaped capture, thanks to his ring. Invisible, he followed the elves and entered their palace. He spent days, maybe weeks, wandering the corridors unseen, stealing food, and trying to find a way to free his friends. He discovered that Thorin was imprisoned in a deep dungeon, and the other dwarves in separate cells. King Thranduil interrogated them, but they refused to reveal the purpose of their journey, and so they remained prisoners. Bilbo's luck changed when he discovered a river that ran beneath the palace. The elves used the river to transport goods, especially empty wine barrels, which were thrown into the water and floated down to Lake Town, Esgaroth. Bilbo devised an audacious plan. He stole the keys to the cells, freed the dwarves, and hid them inside the empty barrels. It was a risky and uncomfortable operation, but it was their only chance. He sealed the barrels and rolled them into the river. At the last moment, he jumped and grabbed onto one of the barrels, being carried by the current out of the elvish realm and toward a new and uncertain destiny. Esgaroth and the Lonely Mountain. The journey inside the barrels was cold, wet, and miserable. The dwarves, squeezed and shaken, could barely breathe, and Bilbo, clinging to one of the barrels in the freezing water, felt exhausted and sick. The current carried them out of Mirkwood and into Long Lake, on whose waters stood the city of Esgaroth. Esgaroth was a city built entirely on wooden stilts on the surface of the lake, a city of merchants and fishermen. The barrels were tied up and taken to the city, where Bilbo, taking advantage of the darkness of the night, managed to free the dwarves. They were weak, hungry, and grumpy, but they were free. Their arrival caused a stir. When Thorin Oakenshield introduced himself as the grandson of the king under the mountain, returning to reclaim his kingdom, the whole city was filled with excitement. Ancient songs and prophecies spoke of the return of the king, who would bring a new era of prosperity, with gold flowing from the mountain. The master of Lake Town, a cunning and pragmatic politician, though skeptical, saw an opportunity to win the people's favor. He welcomed them, gave them food, clothing, and a place to stay. For a few days, the dwarves were treated as heroes, but the sight of the Lonely Mountain on the horizon was a constant reminder of their mission. The mountain, with its dark peaks and a wisp of smoke rising from its summit, seemed sinister and menacing. The joy of the townspeople contrasted with the growing fear in Bilbo's and the dwarves' hearts. They knew that the most dangerous part of their journey was still to come. After a few days of rest, the company set off for the final stage of their journey. The master of Lake Town provided them with boats and supplies, and they rowed across the lake's waters to the desolate shore at the foot of the Lonely Mountain. The land around the mountain was a landscape of ruin and desolation, burned and blackened by the fury of the dragon Smaug years ago. The ancient city of Dale, which lay in the mountain's shadow, was in ruins, a silent testament to the creature's destructive power. The air was cold, and the silence was oppressive. They found the main entrance to the mountain, the great door, but it was blocked and impassable. Their only hope was to find the secret entrance mentioned in the map. After days of exhaustive searching along the mountain's western slope, they finally found a rocky ledge with a smooth wall, exactly as described, but there was no sign of a keyhole. Frustration and despair began to take over the group. Time was running out. They tried to pound on the wall with tools, but the rock was impenetrable. It seemed they had come so far for nothing. It was then that Bilbo, sitting dejectedly, saw a thrush tapping a snail against a gray stone. He remembered the prophecy on the map. "Stand by the gray stone when the thrush knocks," he called the others. As the sun set, a last ray of red light pierced the clouds and hit the rock face. A piece of the wall broke away and fell, revealing a keyhole. Thorin took the key he had inherited from his father, put it in the lock, and turned it with a deep creak. A door opened on the mountainside, revealing a dark tunnel that led into the depths. The secret entrance was open. The silence that followed was more frightening than any noise. The air coming from the tunnel was warm and carried a sharp smell, along with the low, rumbling sound of something immense sleeping inside. The task for which Bilbo had been hired was before him. It was his duty, as the company's burglar, to go in first and face the darkness and terror that lay hidden in the depths of the Lonely Mountain. Bilbo and the dragon, the air emanating from the dark tunnel, was heavy and hot, laden with a metallic smell and a low, rhythmic sound like that of an immense bellows. It was the sound of the dragon sleeping. The fear was almost paralyzing, but Bilbo, feeling the weight of the dwarves' gaze, knew he could not turn back. He was the company's burglar, and this was his moment. Putting the ring on his finger to become invisible, he took a deep breath and entered the darkness. The tunnel went deeper and deeper, and the heat increased. Soon, Bilbo began to see a red glow ahead. He crept to the entrance of a vast underground hall. The sight that awaited him was breathtaking and at the same time terrifying. The hall was filled with an unimaginable treasure, piles and piles of gold coins, jewels, goblets, armor, and precious weapons, glowing under a red light. And sleeping on the largest pile of treasure was Smaug the Magnificent. The dragon was immense, covered in red and golden scales, with large bat wings folded at its sides. Smoke came from its nostrils, and the sound of its snore was like distant thunder. For a moment, Bilbo was paralyzed by the magnificence and terror of the creature. But determined to prove his worth, he crept forward and with trembling hands took a single piece of the treasure, a large two-handled golden cup. And then he retreated as silently as he could and went back to the dwarves. The dwarves were exultant with his success. They passed the cup from hand to hand, marveling at it, but their celebration was short-lived. In the depths of the mountain, Smaug awakened. Even in his deep sleep, he knew every piece of his treasure. He felt the absence of the cup. His fury was immediate and volcanic. With a roar that shook the mountain, he burst through the main entrance, flying through the skies in a whirlwind of fire, searching for the burglar. The company hid inside the secret tunnel, terrified, while the dragon burned the mountainside, destroying their camp and killing their ponies. Smaug, unable to find them, returned to his lair, but not to sleep. He was alert, waiting. The dwarves were desperate, trapped in the tunnel, but Bilbo, feeling a new wave of courage, decided to go back. He knew they needed more information. Invisible, he descended again to the treasure hall. This time, Smaug was awake, his cat-like eyes glowing in the darkness. Pretending to sleep, Bilbo, though invisible, did not go unnoticed. Smaug could not see him, but he could smell him and feel the air he displaced. The dragon began to speak, his voice full of cunning and malice, trying to deceive and intimidate the invisible burglar. Bilbo, remembering stories about how to deal with dragons, answered with riddles, never revealing his name. The conversation was a dangerous game of wits. Smaug boasted of his power and his impenetrable armor, and to prove it, he rolled over and displayed his belly covered in gems and gold that had become encrusted in his skin over centuries of sleeping on the treasure. But in doing so, he inadvertently revealed a weak spot, a small gap in his jeweled armor on the left side of his chest, where his original dragon skin was exposed. Bilbo saw the flaw. He provoked the dragon, who in a fit of rage breathed fire, almost burning him. The hobbit managed to escape back through the tunnel, but not before Smaug got an idea of where the secret passage was located. Back with the dwarves, Bilbo told them about the dragon's weakness. The information was heard by an old thrush, the same one that had revealed the secret of the door, who immediately flew away, carrying the news. Meanwhile, Bilbo, still exploring the treasure, found the most coveted piece of all, the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain, a great white gem that shone with its own light. He was mesmerized by its beauty, and on an impulse, he hid it in his pocket without telling the dwarves. Smaug, convinced that the burglar had received help from the people of Lake Town, decided to take his revenge. With a final roar, he flew out of the mountain and headed toward Esgaroth, a storm of fire and destruction ready to fall upon the defenseless city. The dwarves and Bilbo, trapped in the mountain, could only watch powerless as the dragon's silhouette disappeared into the distance, leaving a menacing silence behind. They were inside the mountain, but the treasure was not yet theirs, and the dragon's fury was now turned on others. The battle of 5 armies, while Smaug's fury was directed at Lake Town. The company in the lonely mountain felt a mixture of relief and guilt. They were safe for now, but they knew that the destruction that would follow was, in part, their responsibility. With the dragon absent, they finally entered the great halls of Erebor. The site of the underground kingdom, though now dark and dusty, was still magnificent. They found the ancient forge, the armory, and the vast halls where the people of Thrain once lived and worked. The treasure had an immediate and dangerous effect on Thorin. The possession of his ancestors' gold awakened in him the dragon sickness, an overwhelming greed and a deep paranoia. He became obsessed with finding the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain, unaware that Bilbo was keeping it hidden. The noble and courageous leader, whom Bilbo had known, was disappearing, replaced by a suspicious king consumed by avarice. Meanwhile, in Esgaroth, Smaug's attack was devastating. The dragon descended upon the wooden city like a flying inferno, setting houses on fire and spreading panic. The city's defense seemed useless against his impenetrable scales. But Bard, an archer descended from the ancient lords of Dale, did not lose hope. He was a grim and courageous man who had foreseen the catastrophe. As the city burned around him, Bard prepared his great yew bow. It was then that the old thrush, who had heard Bilbo on the mountain, landed on his shoulder and told him about the flaw in Smaug's armor. With his last black arrow, a family heirloom, Bard aimed at the weak spot on the left side of the dragon's chest. The arrow flew true, piercing the exposed skin and striking Smaug's heart. With one last dying roar, the great dragon fell from the sky, destroying what was left of Lake Town as he crashed into its waters. The news of Smaug's death spread quickly. The survivors of Esgaroth, led by Bard, sought refuge in the ruins of Dale at the foot of the lonely mountain. They believed they were entitled to a share of the treasure as compensation for the destruction of their city and for the help they had given the dwarves. At the same time, King Thranduil and his army of wood elves, who had also heard about the dragon's death, marched to the mountain, claiming ancient jewels that belonged to them and were in the treasure. When Bard and Thranduil arrived at the mountain, they found the main entrance barricaded. Thorin, maddened by greed, refused to share any part of the treasure. He saw himself as king under the mountain, besieged in his own fortress. The situation was tense, and war between dwarves, men, and elves seemed imminent. Bilbo, seeing Thorin's madness and wanting to prevent bloodshed, made a bold decision. Using his ring, he slipped out of the mountain during the night and went to the camp of the men and elves. He gave them the Arkenstone, the one thing Thorin would trade for, in the hope of forcing a peaceful agreement. The plan, however, only enraged Thorin further. When Bard presented the Arkenstone, Thorin, feeling betrayed by Bilbo, almost threw him from the walls. Gandalf, who had returned at the crucial moment, intervened and saved the Hobbit. Thorin banished Bilbo, but before the battle could begin, a new and terrible threat appeared on the horizon. A vast army of orcs and wargs, led by Bolg, son of Azog the Defiler, who had killed Thorin's grandfather, was marching toward the mountain. They had been informed of the dragon's death and had come to take the treasure for themselves. Faced with a common enemy, dwarves, men, and elves were forced to unite. Thus began the Battle of Five Armies. It was a brutal and desperate confrontation. The allied armies, though fighting bravely, were outnumbered. The battle was unfolding in the valley in front of the mountain, and the tide seemed to be turning against them. Seeing his allies about to be defeated, Thorin finally overcame his madness. Leading his 12 companions, he charged out of the mountain in a furious assault, carving a path through the orcs. His courage inspired the others, and the battle intensified. But Thorin's charge left him exposed. He was mortally wounded in the fight against Bolg and his bodyguards. When all seemed lost, the eagles arrived once more, bringing Beorn in his bear form. Beorn's fury on the battlefield was terrifying, and he cut a path through the orcs, killing bold and turning the tide of the battle. The orc army, without its leader, was finally defeated and scattered. The victory, however, was bitter. Bilbo, who had been knocked out by a stone at the beginning of Thorin's charge, woke up to find the battlefield silent and covered with the dead. He was taken to Thorin, who was dying. In his last moments, Thorin asked Bilbo for forgiveness. If more of us valued food and Shire and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world, he said. With those words, the king under the mountain died. The return home and the end of the journey, the victory in the Battle of Five Armies, was won at a terrible price. The valley in front of the lonely mountain was silent, covered in the snow that had begun to fall and the bodies of the fallen. In addition to Thorin, his nephews Fili and Kili had also died, heroically defending their uncle. The sadness for the loss of their friends weighed on everyone, turning the gleam of the treasure into something dark and worthless. With Thorin's death, the leadership of the dwarves passed to his cousin, Dane Ironfoot, who had arrived with reinforcements shortly before the end of the battle. Dane, now king under the mountain, proved to be a wise and just leader. He honored the agreement that Thorin had refused to fulfill, giving a fair share of the treasure to Bard and the people of Lake Town, who used the wealth to rebuild their city and the ancient city of Dale, of which Bard became the new lord. King Thranduil also received the jewels he had claimed. Peace and friendship between dwarves, men, and elves were restored. Bilbo, for his part, wanted no treasure. He had had his fill of adventures and dangers. His only wish was to go back home, to his comfortable hobbit hole in the Shire. He said goodbye to his remaining dwarf friends, who now lived and worked in the mountain, bringing back the glory of the kingdom of Erebor. The journey back was very different from the way there. Bilbo traveled in the company of Gandalf, and the path seemed safer and less threatening. They passed through Rivendell again, where Bilbo could rest and share his stories with Elrond. He had learned a lot during his journey, not only about the world, but about himself. The hobbit who loved comfort and hated adventures had become a brave, resourceful individual with a much broader perspective on the world. Finally, after more than a year of absence, Bilbo arrived at the borders of the Shire. The sight of the familiar green hills filled his heart with joy. But his reception was not what he expected. Upon arriving at Bag End, he found a great commotion. A crowd of hobbits was gathered in front of his hobbit hole, and an auction was underway. His own furniture and belongings were being sold. He had been presumed dead, and his relatives, the Sackville Bagginses, were about to take possession of his home. Bilbo had to go through a long and complicated process to prove his identity and reclaim his property. He succeeded, but his reputation in the Shire was never the same. He was now the odd Baggins, the hobbit who disappeared for long periods and received visits from dwarves and wizards. He had lost the respect of his neighbors, but gained something far more valuable, self-respect and the memories of a great adventure. Bilbo lived a long and happy life in his hobbit hole. He wrote his memoirs in a red-covered book, which he titled There and Back Again. He spent his days smoking his pipe, writing poetry, and receiving visits from old friends. The map and the sword sting were hung on the wall, and the ring he kept secret remained hidden in a drawer. The world had changed, and so had he. He could have returned to the comfort of his old life, but the journey had transformed him forever. He was a small being in a vast world, but he had played a crucial part in great events, proving that even the most ordinary person can find the courage to change the course of history. His adventure had ended, but his story, and that of the ring he found in the darkness, was just beginning.